If you talk about the NBA enough, you're going to get some stuff wrong eventually. It happens to me, it happens to everybody that covers the sport. But what's unique about today's video is these are trades that every single person that followed the sport, that covered the sport, was wrong about who won or lost these trades, what the ultimate outcome of these deals were going to be. And when I think of that, there's always one trade for me that comes to mind, and that's the first trade we're going to be covering today, and that is when Paul George was traded from Indiana to the Oklahoma City Thunder. And the trade was very simple. It was Paul George in exchange for Domantas Sabonis and Victor Oladipo. And at the time, Paul George had let it be known to Indiana that he did not want to re-sign with the team, and he wanted to go somewhere else. He gave them the heads up in advance of free agency, in which he could have just left as a free agent. Indiana was actively shopping him. There were a couple of different situations here that he could have ended up going to, including one where he was very, very close to going to Cleveland, which would have gotten Indiana, I think, Gary Harris and some picks. There's a different version of that as well where Kevin Love is involved. But ultimately, this deal goes down, and every single person that followed the NBA did not understand how Indiana was only able to get two players at the time we did not think very highly of. Sabonis was the 11th pick in the draft the year before, averaged 5.9 points per game as a rookie in Oklahoma City in a weird situation where Russ is all of a sudden there running the show by himself. They needed as much floor spacing as they could get, and Domantas Sabonis was out there to shoot threes and to space the floor. 5.9 points per game as a rookie, and Victor Oladipo did not have a fantastic season the year before either. He looked like basically the same guy that he was in Orlando, that struggled to space the floor, that was a little bit too small in terms of finishing at the rim, and yes, was a good defensive player, but was not an all-star caliber guy. And the situation in Oklahoma City for his only season there was not an ideal situation to showcase what he ultimately showed as an Indiana Pacer. And you think about the fact that this was essentially the trade package that Oklahoma City got in exchange for Serge Ibaka, and then a year later, they're trading away that same trade package in exchange for Paul George. It made absolutely no sense at the time. Nobody understood how it was possible. Now, in hindsight, the market for George was probably more limited than we realized for two different reasons. One, the value in superstar trades has gone up tenfold since this trade happened 5-6 years ago, and also the fact that George was going to be a free agent in a year and a half from the time that this deal was made in 2017 made this maybe a little bit more of a limited market than we realized at the time. Now, ultimately, Oladipo becomes an all-NBA caliber player, Sabonis becomes an all-star, and when you're trading, even trading away someone like Paul George, when you're getting an all-NBA caliber guy and an all-star in exchange for one player, that's fantastic value. Unfortunately for Indiana, those careers were a little bit short-lived for Oladipo, at least specifically in terms of his all-NBA peak. It was one season, then he kept getting hurt, and then Sabonis, while a good player for a couple years, ultimately got moved as well. They got Halliburton, works out really well for them, but this is a deal to me that every single person at the time didn't understand how the value was what it was, and actually both teams ended up winning, and so everybody was wrong. Also in 2017 is another one that I always think of when it comes to everybody having the same reaction to the deal, and that's when DeMarcus Cousins ends up in New Orleans. So essentially, it's the 2017 trade deadline. DeMarcus Cousins is averaging like 28 points per game for another awful Kings team. The year before was the first time in his career since getting drafted in 2010 that they had won 30 games. This Kings team that he gets traded away from ends up winning 32 games. So the Kings are terrible. Cousins is putting up big numbers, and randomly, it seemed pretty random, the Kings decided it was time to move on from DeMarcus Cousins. They tried to sign him to an extension, but he wanted more money they were willing to offer. There was some issues with the coach. He was just unhappy in Sacramento. They hadn't had the team success, and they trade DeMarcus Cousins, again, averaging almost 28 points per game at the time of the trade. Granted, for a bad Kings team, but an incredibly talented player. This is the trade. It's Cousins and Omri Caspi going to New Orleans in exchange for Tyreek Evans, Langston Galloway, Buddy Hield, a 2017 first, and a 2017 second. Now, you might hear that and think, oh, well, Tyreek Evans, like he was pretty good at the time, right? No, like him and Langston Galloway were both like relatively interesting veteran type players at this point. Like Tyreek Evans was not a high upside, high value guy for Sacramento to be bringing in here. The main prize of the trade was Buddy Hield, who was the 6th pick in the draft the year before and had a pretty solid career to that point in New Orleans. Clearly was going to be a good shooter, and famously, the owner of the Kings reportedly thought that Buddy Hield had like Steph Curry level potential, and he really wanted to get Buddy Hield on the team, and that was the foundation and the fulcrum of this DeMarcus Cousins trade, and then of course the future first round pick as well. But essentially the way this trade boils down in terms of like assets you would want to get in exchange for a star in today's NBA was Buddy Hield and a first round pick. And I cannot overemphasize, however you want to say it. I have to make sure everybody understands, like DeMarcus Cousins was incredible at the time of this trade. You don't just accidentally average 28 points per game as a big man in the NBA, and nobody understood why Sacramento was so willing to give up on one of their most talented players that their franchise had ever seen. New Orleans was trying desperately to keep Anthony Davis happy. Ultimately, they were correct because AD would ask out of New Orleans in pretty quick order after this move, but they really want to try and make something work. They go with this Twin Towers approach. If you understand anything about this trade, understand this. It was going to work. So they finish out this season. This deal happens at the deadline. The following season, at the time DeMarcus Cousins tears his Achilles, in which his career is basically ended in that moment, New Orleans is only a couple of games above 500, but the AD Cousins thing was working. Like, they were overwhelming with their size. Each of them could still space the floor a little bit. They had some interesting players around those two guys. If they had stayed healthy, I'm not saying Anthony Davis would still be in New Orleans, because I think it was pretty clear he wanted to be in LA, but like, it really, really could have worked. But the part that everybody was wrong about was this idea that Sacramento traded away like this great player and that DeMarcus Cousins was going to have a fantastic career moving forward, because that just didn't happen. The Achilles injury, then he goes to Golden State, which again, everybody freaked out about, ultimately about nothing. Sacramento still got like kind of good value when you consider what Cousins turned into afterwards due to injury. They got some okay value out of Hield eventually via trade. That 2017 first turned into Zach Collins, but they moved it, and it was like Justin Jackson and Harry Giles, I believe, is what they turned that first round pick into. And we were all wrong about this. Like, we all thought they were giving away DeMarcus Cousins, and really his value around the league was lower than anybody thought or realized at the time. And then of course, with the injury issues on top of it, that kind of came to fruition throughout the rest of DeMarcus Cousins' career. Next up now, let me ask you a question. What do you think of when someone says the biggest failure of a super team in the history of the league? I think the Nets have a couple of different options there for you to pick from, but one of the ones that always gets brought up is the LA Lakers with Dwight Howard and Kobe and Steve Nash, and that's the subject of our next trade here. So in the 2012 offseason, there's a very complicated deal that includes like 4 teams and 20 different pieces, but essentially the Lakers trade away Andrew Bynum and a little bit of other stuff in exchange for Dwight Howard. This ends the 1.5 to 2 year long saga of Dwight Howard trying to get his way out of Orlando, puts him in LA alongside Kobe. They bring in Steve Nash as well. They've got either Ron Artest or Metta World Peace at the time, and a really, really interesting group and an incredibly talented one. And everybody thought that this was a finals bound team. Everybody thought that they were one of the best teams in the entire conference. Everybody thought that they were a team that potentially it was going to be them and the Heat in the next couple of finals. Like what we ended up with Cleveland and Golden State throughout the middle of the 2010s, where it's like every single year, 4 years in a row, these guys are playing each other. That's what everybody thought was going to happen between the at the time Miami Heatles as well as this Lakers team bringing in Dwight. And it is as big of a catastrophe as we've ever seen in terms of expectations for a team and what they actually achieved. They had injury issues. They could not figure out how to get their roles to fit together. Mike D'Antoni ends up becoming the coach, and they can't get his offense figured out because Dwight doesn't want to roll to the rim anymore. He wants to be this like weird post-up version of himself. Steve Nash basically never played. And the biggest issue with all of this is the fact that Howard leaves the year after. Like if you're LA and you're trading stuff away, yes, Bynum's career was basically done after he got traded away. He was an all-star though at the time that the Lakers traded him away. If you're going to make that move, you're trying to re-sign Dwight Howard. He ends up going to Houston after just one season in LA, and that's the beginning of the end right there. I mean, this is a team that was still making the finals regularly at the time that they made this trade, and everything goes completely downhill from there. And again, it's one of those things where everybody's expectations were here for this team after the trade, and then they did not achieve them whatsoever. And the next up now, I love this trade. I think it's going to be such an interesting and intriguing one to look back on because it's far from over right now. Russell Westbrook going to Houston in exchange for Chris Paul, and I want to make sure I get the picks correct here. A 2021 first round pick swap, a 2024 first, top 4 protected, a 2025 first round pick swap, top 20 protected, and a 2026 first round pick, top 4 protected. The concept at the time and the thing that everybody was wrong about was all centered around Chris Paul. Everybody, myself included, thought that Chris Paul's career was pretty much done. Like his career is like a high level, all NBA caliber player. It looked like he lost a step in the season prior to this deal in Houston. And for someone that's as small as Chris Paul is, like if you lose a step, it's probably the fall off is probably gonna happen pretty quickly when you're as old as Chris Paul was at the time of the deal. And we were wrong not only about Chris Paul's career being over, but we also wrong about Oklahoma City being able to get anything in exchange for Chris Paul, because the reason that this deal looks the way it does is because, one, it was seen as at the time for Houston an upgrade going from Chris Paul to Russell Westbrook, but also they were trying to dump Chris Paul's contract. He's someone that still had a ton of money left on his deal, was getting older, and Oklahoma City was taking on that money. He ends up playing for Oklahoma City. They're a playoff team. They were a really, really good team that year, and then they get value again out of Chris Paul a year later. He ends up in Phoenix and signs a whole nother contract with Phoenix after everybody, myself included, thought that Chris Paul was done. There's so many factors to that, not only his play in Houston the year prior, but also his height and his size and his age, and every single person was really, really wrong about this deal. It's not necessarily like, oh my gosh, we all thought Houston was going to be this incredible team. I think overall people thought it was an intriguing and an interesting deal, but it really has everything to do with what we thought of Chris Paul in terms of where he was at that point in his career and where he ended up moving forward. What I want to know here at the end is some moves or some trades, some free agency signings that you were completely wrong about at the time. Whatever your reaction was at the time that it happened, you ended up being completely 100% wrong. Leave those down in the comment section below for me. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see y'all next time.